In the fall of 1977, I was a graduate student at Western Kentucky, and we had the required folk music class. And for my project, I researched a murder ballad from the 1930s about a very famous general. But I had a friend of mine, Jim Brown. Jim actually at that point was already a tenured faculty member in the history department at Stanford University in Russian history of all things. And Jim took his first sabbatical to come and take a semester of folklore classes. Jim has kind of not thrown Russian history under the bus, so to say, but he actually has done a lot of good folklore work in Alabama and is very active in the folklore society there. I'm going to show you two photographs that are central to this presentation. I first saw these in the fall of 1977. The photos belong to Mrs. Ida Springs, nee Roberts, who was 90 years old at the time and lived just outside of Livingston, on the plateau near Rock Crusher Mountain with two of her adult daughters. Jim's mother-in-law had grown up across the road from the Springs and was a friend of Ida's eldest daughter, Mabel. They were in their 60s at the time. Jim's original intention was to publish a paper documenting the musical heritage of the Roberts family, but when it became apparent to him that the fieldwork was producing uneasiness about how the family might be portrayed and worries about why a white male was inquiring into family history, he felt it best to limit the distribution of his work in a way that would ensure that these photos would not be published in the immediate future. And he also used a pseudonym to protect Mrs. Springs. I was lucky enough to be given copies of the two photographs with the stipulation that I would not share them. And I honored that request. About the same time as the first time I encountered Walker Evans' Let Us Now Praise Famous Men. His photos of white sharecroppers are straightforward, powerful, and iconic. I found these photographs to be very much like that. Like many other readers, whenever I looked at Evans's photos of the woods, the rickets, and the gudgers, I always wondered what happened to them. And I also wondered what happened to the Roberts. When I retired in 2017, I contacted Jim for the first time since the spring of 1978. We picked up right where we left off. And we agreed to cooperate on resurrecting his old class project, and that's why I've listed his name first. I've been basically the archivist and the researcher. Jim has done most of the field work here back in 1977 and also a little bit this past fall. So this is the first photograph. This picture of the three men is the oldest of the two and was made sometime in the first decade of the 20th century. Has anyone ever seen this photograph before? Where'd you see it, Bobby?
I can't recall. There's an online source that popped up.
Okay. The only places, yes, Roby.
Yeah, it was. This is the one that was on the community center, in the Walnut Community Center up at Free Hill.
Yes.
And I hear that historian Van West took a photograph of it and then put it on their web page.
I've run into it in Ancestry in a couple of different places, mostly from people who are associated with the Roberts family. It does appear in print. Wally Karif, who is a history professor at TTU in 2004, has an article entitled African American Contributions to the Upper Cumberland. It's edited by Mike Birdwell and Calvin Dickinson. The article provides one short paragraph on music that virtually is so general that it really doesn't add anything. It also misidentifies two of the people in this photograph. The other place that I've heard is, I guess it was around 2010, that there was the museum exhibit at Free Hill, and my impression was that other than the names, there wasn't much information provided. It is in the digital archive at MTSU, and it's credited to the Folklore Society, the Tennessee Folklore Society. So somebody gave a copy of it, but that's as far as it got out. That was one of the first things I wanted to do when I started to, where has this been published? Where has it appeared before? What about the instruments? Anybody have anything to say about the instruments here? I mean, I play, the banjo appears to maybe perhaps be a mail order. I don't know. Can anybody say anything about the way that the men are holding their bows? Is this, and their fiddles, is this basically, I mean, the one on the right, on the left we have John, who is the eldest. He's Ida Springs' great uncle. This is her brother Barlow, and this is Calvin Roberts, her father. Calvin seems to be holding the fiddle the way that I've usually heard that old-time fiddlers in that area held it, which is down here, but his grand uncle is holding it up under his chin, which seems interesting. Clothing, according to a friend of mine who's a historian on clothing, is that these are most probably off-the-rack clothes. And she says that because their pants are all cuffed. So they weren't custom made, they weren't fitted. But they are basically dressed up for the occasion, although only John is wearing a vest. The two other men, if they were fully, supposedly, according to her, if they were really, but then again, look at Calvin, his suit coat is completely shut. What about the expressions on their faces? I mean, this is these are questions I've been asking for 40 years. John has sort of a rakish sort of look as he kind of ironically looking into the camera, obviously taken by a family member. Calvin isn't really looking at the camera, and this may be the onset of visual problems. He eventually goes wrong, related to agricultural work. John has his legs crossed, Calvin is sitting straight. Look at Barlow, looking straight into the camera. Looking straight at who's ever taking the picture. Whoever is going to see this picture is going to see him. Look at his legs. Displayed, comfortable, relaxed, confident. Mrs. Springs dated the photo to around 1900 or 1902, but it was probably a little later than that. How old would you say Barlow is? The fellow in the center playing the banjo. Approximately. Or late teens. He was born in 1891, so add that on to 1890. So it was probably before 1910. A little later than what she said. And this is the second picture. This is taken about some 10 to 20 years later. Ida's father, Calvin, appears on the left with his wife, Audie. And on the right is his uncle, Hud. His given name is Willis, but his middle name was Huddleston after his mother's family. And so he goes by the name Hud, and that's his wife, Leanne. Not only are these two gentlemen related, these are two sisters. Not uncommon in the family that brothers, or in this case, an uncle and a nephew, marry into the same family. Thanks to the help of Paula Stover, the curator at the Overton County Heritage Museum, I was able to uncover a third photograph that seems to be from the same period and features Calvin and Addie sitting in front of what is most probably, this is their home in Alpine. By 1977, all of the subjects were dead. Barlow, the youngest, died in 1971. While some of the descendants still live in Tennessee to this day, most have scattered far and wide. Today, it seems that no African Americans named Robert live in Overton County, although there are several that live in Putnam and one in McMinnville, but they're all in their 90s, except for a nephew, Scotty, who is 60. With the help of family history on file at the Overton County Heritage Museum, several members of the Roberts family who still live in Tennessee, census records, and other information from printed sources, we have tried to piece together at least some of the musical and the cultural heritage of this family and attempting to understand what this might reveal about life in the Upper Cumberland. The main road from Middle Tennessee into Overton County was named the Roberts Highway, for Albert Houston Roberts, who was governor of Tennessee from 1919 to 1921, and we're coming up on that centennial. Governors then in Tennessee only had 2-year terms, and he only had a 2-year term partly because he supported the women's suffrage amendment, which passed by 1 vote in the Tennessee Senate. A historical marker in Livingston celebrates his career. Another historical marker noting his birthplace, which is in Alpine, some 7 miles west of Livingston on Highway 52 on the Cumberland Plateau, no longer exists. This is a photograph from 1977 that indicates his birthplace and where the original Roberts, he is the grandson of the plantation founder. Born in 1868, Albert Roberts came from an affluent family that owned slaves before the Civil War. His paternal grandfather, Jesse Roberts, was the most prosperous valley in the whole area around Nettle Carrier Creek. This is before it was known as Alpine. The centerpiece of the plantation was a 2-story mansion house known locally as the Brick House. There may be a photograph of it. I've heard that perhaps was published in the Overton paper maybe 30, 40 years ago, but I have not had the chance to go and try and find it. While oral sources in 1977 estimating his plantation to have been well over 1,000 acres were correct. Actually, it was more like 4,000 acres. 450 of them were improved. Assertions that he owned some 250 slaves were exaggerated. According to slave schedules for Overton County, Jesse Roberts owned 12 slaves in 1840, 23 slaves in 1850, and 40 by 1860. Those 40 slaves would have made up a significant contribution to his estimated personal value of $45,000, which today would be a fortune of over $1.5 million. An incredibly wealthy man. The plantation primarily grew corn, but also harvested rye, wheat, oats, and flour. This is a map of the Alpine area. This is the Jamestown Highway, 5. And just before you enter Alpine, on what's known as Means Creek Lane, just past the home of Mildred Hardy, there is a gravel road that will take you to the house site and to the site of the Roberts family grave cemetery. Mrs. Mildred Arney was very kind to us. She's 90, but very, very, very lively, very active, and she actually went with us and unlocked the gate for us. Her family owns the property now. And here's a close-up. That's okay. Here's a close-up. This shows you where the brick house was located, and approximately less than 100 yards away is the Roberts Cemetery. In the Civil War, Overton County was badly torn. While it was not a major slaveholding area, only 2% of the population owned slaves, it was Southern in geography and sympathies. Both Champ Ferguson and Tinker Dave Beatty, names most probably that don't mean much of you who aren't from Tennessee, were back and forth through the area as they were through most of the Upper Cumberland region. There's a legend associated with them and the Roberts plantation, which was recounted by both Mrs. Springs, who is black, and Mrs. Jewel Smith, a white informant who was living on the property back in 1977 in virtually identical form. One day when the men were working out in the field, a troop of horsemen rode up. Which side, they don't necessarily know. One of the riders absent-mindedly stuck his riding switch into the ground. The switch took root and grew into an apple tree, famed in the area for the eating apples that it produced. A similar literary legend about one of George Washington's aides appears in print in Connecticut in the 19th century. The tree in question was supposedly blown down just a few years before Jim arrived. Let me show you a few more photographs of the cemetery here real quick. This is the house site. This is where the original house site would have been. There are pecan trees, obviously not original, but certainly old, and most probably, and there's still the area where the house would have sat, basically oriented toward the east, and on a hill overlooking the creek and the valley, and then just immediately to the Southwest is the graveyard. This is a photograph that Jim took of the graveyard in 1977. Here's some pictures of the graveyard today. Now fenced in because of livestock in the area. There are a lot of cows that graze there. And you'll notice that there's a comb grave, and more about that later. Okay, and there's Jesse Roberts' gravestone. Henry Clay Roberts, who is a confirmed African American who's buried in the family graveyard, and there are reports that the comb grave may also include an African American. This, unfortunately, I could not. I was working with a contact sheet, and this is about as best as I could get it. The name there is I.W. Roberts, and the only person who has the first initial I is an African American. Idella. According to oral sources, at the end of the war, the plantation owner, who is remembered in oral sources as Farley Roberts, most probably his son John, deeded a plot of land behind Green Hill Cemetery on Goose Creek Road to each black family and built a house for each. This is the plantation house site and the cemetery site. Across from Mildred Garney's home is the Green Hill Cemetery, and to the left is Goose Creek Lane, and this is the area where the Black Roberts went to live. According to oral sources, Farley Roberts deeded a plot of land behind Green Hill Cemetery on Goose Creek to each black family and built a house for each. However, to a former Overton County historian, the white Roberts avoided some of the hardship that many landowners had after the conflict by selling the poorer part of their land to their share and having the black families sharecrop it. We do know that one of Calvin's son paid taxes on approximately 120 acres in that area up until the early 1950s, I believe. An oral account, which may be of antebellum origin, touches on the musical tradition in the Roberts family and was passed down to Mrs. Jewel Smith, the person who was living, the white person who was living on the property in 1977, by her grandfather, Elvin Murdoch. As a young man, he was riding horseback with his sister through Livingston and over the mountain to attend a wedding at the Roberts home. When the horse fell and broke his sister's leg, she was carried to the brick house and stayed there until she was well enough to travel. Elvin later told his granddaughter about seeing at least 75 little black children dancing on the limestone slabs that flanked the house. While the number is clearly exaggerated, there were at least 20 slaves under the age of 12 who were on the plantation in 1860. As was fairly common after emancipation, the Roberts, like many other slaves, took the family name of their owners. Henry K., also known as Harry Roberts, is the patriarch of the African-American Roberts family. He was born in 1804 in North Carolina, and around the time the Civil War ended, he lived on the farm of John Allen Roberts, Jesse Roberts' son, and had married Dicey Huddleston Roberts. They had 7 children. The 2 oldest men in the photograph were his fiddle-playing brother John and his son Willis, known as Hud, who were also born as slaves. And this is just showing you partial pictures you've already seen. This is John T. Roberts, the fiddler on the left in the first photograph, who was born in 1838. At some point after the Civil War, he and his wife Mariah moved to Allgood with their 3 children, but by 1880 they're back on Goose Creek in Alpine. By 1900, the period when the first photograph was taken, his wife had died. John continued living in Alpine with his sister Darthula, who never married and dies in September of 1930 at age 92. Willis Huddleston, the fiddler on the right, Ida Spring's great uncle, was born in 1846. He and his wife Leanne Cox Roberts lived next door to Willis on Goose Creek and were childless. Willis dies in 1836 at the age of 90. According to family tradition, John Calvin Roberts was born in 1857 to Mary Roberts, the daughter of Henry Kay and the sister of Hud. In 1880, he was living with his grandfather, and that's about the time that he began playing the fiddle, when he's a teenager, 16, 17 years old. In 1884, he married Addie Cox, Leanne Roberts' sister, and over the next 8 years, they had 5 children, 4 boys and 1 girl. Calvin gradually loses his sight and dies in early 1942. Barlow Roberts, the banjo player in the first photograph and the son of Calvin and Audie, was born in 1891. Barlow also played guitar and French harp, according to the family. In 1917, he marries Mary Armstrong Roberts and moved to Monroe, which is north of Livingston in Overton County, and later to Livingston. After his wife's death, Barlow moved the family to Cookeville. 8 of their children lived into adulthood. Several of his children remained in Tennessee and had children of their own. As Linda pointed out, African American musicians played important roles in rural society. Plantation slaves with musical talent were often trained so they could play at parties and dances of the owners. Slaves with musical talent and training also could have increased value, both monetarily and personally. Back in '77, when Jim commented about the handsome mustache and beard of her great-uncle John, Miss Ida said, "Now this old man was smart and he would try to fool Master Jesse." She went on to tell a story about all the slaves going to work in the fields together, and once they got there, John would keep on going and walk the 6 miles to Livingston, over the ridge, and into Livingston, where he would work for wages, and then walk the 6 miles back just in time to return with the field hands for night quarter check. This story about John T. walking into town to work for wages would seem to hint that such clandestine behavior might not be tolerated by just any slave. As plantation musicians, John and Hud likely played to entertain the other slaves as well as themselves and their white owners. Such a diverse audience made up of blacks and whites would require, by necessity, that the Roberts develop a diverse repertoire that would appeal to all various elements in the audience. Unfortunately, we have virtually no clues of what that repertoire was. The Upper Cumberland after the Civil War appears to be not as stratified as other areas in the South. Calvin was invited on a regular basis to accompany the wife of Houston Allen Roberts, the future governor of Tennessee, on her piano when he was a school teacher in Alpine. Calvin's granddaughter Mabel was fond of saying that that was the only time in his life that her grandfather played the violin. As soon as he stepped out of the house, he was just fiddling. According to memory of some family members, Roberts primarily played dance music and instrumentals and only sang occasionally. But as far as their actual repertoire, we know very little. We do know that Mabel remembers her grandfather playing Listen to the Mockingbird. After moving to the Goose Creek area, the Roberts performed at private parties and dances for both white and black audiences, and sometimes in Livingston on the courthouse grounds. According to Barlow's daughters, Barlow and Calvin would sometimes go to Nashville to play, but they don't know where, possibly busking on the street. The Roberts also regularly played on their front porches when the weather was good, and it wasn't uncommon for white people to come and listen. When asked about relations in such a racially mixed audience, one informant said that there were usually no problems except on some occasions when there were white women present. Paulette Roberts Gore, who was Barlow's granddaughter, remembers Barlow playing at parties in Crossville in the early 1950s for what she calls rich white folks. When she was a little girl, her grandfather often recruited her to accompany him and to dance while he played, but she was warned to never let her mother know. When asked if she remembered any particular songs that he played, she thought that one of the banjo tunes she liked the best was called Grasshopper, and that's all we know about their repertoire. The black community of Alpine and in Overton County as a whole gradually evaporated. The census of 1870 shows only 550 blacks in the entire county, less than half of what had been there in 1860. The diaspora of the Roberts family in the late 19th and early 20th century is similar to what Charles Wolfe describes in the lost tradition of the black string band. The last record of John Roberts' 3 children living in Overton County is the 1880 census. In the case of Calvin's 5 children, his 2 oldest sons, Alfred and Dillard, married sisters, and they moved to Oklahoma before 1920. Calvin's daughter Ida marries Harry Springs in 1914 and moves to Livingston, where she becomes a school teacher and lives there for the rest of her life. His youngest son, Mitchell, moves to Detroit in the 1930s and works at the Ford Rouge plant. Barlow had 8 children who lived to adulthood. 5 of his daughters lived in Cookeville, the other in McMinnville. Howard, his eldest son, moved to Dayton, Ohio, and his son DeWitt to Livingston for a period of time before he moved to Park City, Kentucky. Against this background of community disintegration, the disappearance of fiddling and black string bands among African Americans in the Upper Cumberland is not hard to understand. However, as an old teacher of mine, John Blatch, used to say, scratch an early blues player and you're most likely to find an ancestor who's a fiddle player. Well, the Roberts family tradition of playing music lives on in one of Barlow's grandsons. Roy Roberts, born in Livingston in 1943, but he grows up in Park City, Kentucky, listening to blues and R&B on the radio. At the age of 14, he purchases his first guitar, a Sears Silvertone. At 18, he moves to Greensboro, North Carolina, and begins to play in local bands, and before long, he's touring with the likes of Solomon Burke, Eddie Floyd, and Otis Redding. He's been performing for 59 years now as an accompanist, as well as leading his own band, and has recorded well over a dozen solo albums. Interesting, though, Roy is only dimly aware of Calvin. He knows a little bit more about Barlow, but he basically credits his musical interest from his mother's side. His mother played piano, and her uncle Landis Allen taught her, and so his first instrument was the piano, and then as a young teenager begins picking up the guitar. Over the past 15 years or so, Roy and his cousin Scotty, who lives in Allgood, have arranged several concerts in Livingston and have split the profits with the Overton County Heritage Museum. In the case of DeFord Bailey and Howard Armstrong, we have recordings, we have pictures, we have interviews, we have a wealth of information. But once you get beyond that, we end up with situations like we do with the Lusk Band in Warren County, where we have recordings, but we don't have much personal information. But no pictures. In this case, we have the pictures, but not much else in terms of audio. But slowly, we are at least adding to the history of this area. As a way of closing, I want to show you a picture of Jim's first informant. There's Roy Roberts, by the way. This would have been, I think, from the early 70s, when he's playing country music because he won't play disco. This is Ida Roberts Springs. This photograph is one of the reasons that Jim's article was never published. It's a beautiful photograph, isn't it?
Yes.
Miss Ida hated it. She was working out in her yard, and a local photographer, professional photographer, came down and convinced her to come with him to his studio where he took this picture. He then sold hundreds, if not thousands, of copies of this photograph, making a not small amount of money. But I don't think it was the money that bothered Miss Ida, from what I've heard. What I think bothered her was the fact that the photograph was distributed widely in Overton County and elsewhere, and she's not in her Sunday best. That's what offended her, and that's part of the reason that Jim, backed off in terms of publishing, because they were really afraid that if she didn't like this photograph of her, I imagine what they would have thought of distribution of that other photograph. Anyway, I'd like to thank you all for coming today. I appreciate being here.